Come and join me as I read the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis and discuss them from a Christian perspective, starting with The Magician's Nephew. Hello, welcome back to my channel Christian Faith and Fiction. My name's Lou. I am going to be taking you on a journey with me as I am reading through the first book chronologically in the Chronicles of Narnia. This is The Magician's Nephew. Many people have read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe or seen the films of that. This is the prequel to that book. So this one follows a kind of origin story for the witch in the second book. And also, if you remember from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Professor Kirk, whose house the children get sent to as evacuees, Professor Kirk is Diggory in this book. So that's his story when he's a boy. This is the story of how they discovered Narnia in the first place and how the witch got into Narnia. So far, I've reread the first 3 chapters and I'm finding lots of similarities to Genesis chapters 1 to 3. Now, I'm going to go through the story in quite a lot of detail, so if you haven't already read this book, I really suggest that you go ahead, save this video to watch later, your playlist, and come back to it either when you've read the whole of the book or when you've read the first 3 chapters, and then stop and start as I'm going through it if you like. But definitely you want to read this one first because I'm going to give you a lot of spoilers through it. Okay, I'm guessing that if you're still carrying on that you either have read it or you don't care about that. So it starts off the book with Diggory and Polly, and they're in a kind of row of terraced houses in London. And Diggory is quite upset because his father is still in India and he's had to come live with his uncle and aunt because his mum is really sick and is going to die. And he gets talking to his next door neighbour called Polly, who has been living in London all her life, I think. And because of what he shares with Polly, they become firm friends. And this beginning bit really kind of spoke to me about how in the beginning God said about Adam that it was not good for him to be alone, and that he created Eve to be a companion for him. And just how much we need friendships, especially when going through like really tough stuff. Like if you have a relative that is got terminal illness or something, you really want someone who can be there with you, alongside you, even if you don't kind of necessarily talk about it all the time. Just having somebody else there with you so you don't feel alone is something that I can imagine you really want at those times. And God really designed us to be in a relationship with each other, to have good friends. And that's something that I've always prayed for and wanted throughout life. And we don't always have that as children because we can't kind of get out and about and mix socially with people outside of the people that we normally see. So if you do have someone that kind of turns up in your area, then you are really blessed to have them with you. The first chapter is called The Wrong Door, and a lot of this book to begin with is talking about, how the curiosity of Diggory and Polly led them to go exploring in the attics of their house, and how they decided that they wanted to go and explore the empty house on the other side of Diggory's house. And also the curiosity of Diggory's uncle in the second chapter. His Uncle Andrew is getting into all sorts of magic and kind of dodgy areas with his supposedly fairy godmother, who has magic dust that he gets inherits from her, and he is kind of searching after all sorts of magical lands and different things. But he's kind of going about it in the wrong way, looking in dark places, and it turns his hair white and kind of changes him for life, really. And also it was speaking to me a lot about how so many people are looking for the supernatural, I know even, in the book community, if you look at other booktube channels, you see so many of the fantasy books have their magic system based around the occult and things like practices that people, at least in my country, people still do practice, like witchcraft and tarot card reading and divining, ley lines, looking for those, and all sorts of other things that are basically searching in the wrong places. They're going through the wrong doors looking for the supernatural. And I believe that God has put in our hearts that desire for the supernatural, for things outside of this world, for looking for other worlds, as it were. Basically, as a desire and a longing for heaven and for the presence of God. But so easily we can get sidetracked and go through the wrong doors and get involved in stuff that actually can be damaging to us if we are not looking in the right places. C.S. Lewis did have a Christian faith, and that kind of comes out throughout all of his books. Now, I don't believe that he's really writing a retelling of Genesis in this book, but there are definitely themes and principles that come throughout the book, and we'll see more of those as we go through. In chapter 3 of this one, they get into the wood between the worlds, and that's a place that is kind of an other place. And once again, curiosity comes to the forefront, where Diggory really wants to go exploring in the other worlds. And I was wondering, what would I have done? First of all, what would I have done if my best friend had disappeared, picked up a ring and disappeared out of this world? Would I have gone after them to try and find them? Would I have had the courage to step out? Part of me would have been just scared to death, and part of me would have been really curious and wanting the adventure, especially as a child. And then when they got into the wood and they discovered that they were able to go in and out of any of the pools that were there that led into other worlds, would I have chosen to come straight back at that point, or would I have chosen to go and explore other places? I don't know whether I would or not. And that kind of, those opportunities are there, but would I have taken it? I don't know. And was it a good thing in the end? Well, we'll wait and see about that one. I'm about halfway through The Magician's Nephew now, and got further on with the story. So since I last caught up with you, Diggory and Polly ended up going into a new world through the pools that they jumped into, and that was the world of Charn, where in the middle of that dead city there was a room full of statues, and in the middle of that room was a kind of tower, not a tower, like some kind of table thing with a bell on it and a hammer and magical words written on the side which say, "Take your chance, adventurous stranger, ring the bell and bide the danger, or wander till it sends you mad. What would have happened if you had?" I think that's right, something like that. And so this is basically where Diggory is tempted to ring that bell and find out what happens. And I always see the kind of comparisons with the Genesis story of being, this is the temptation for him, where he it comes up again later on, and the theme of temptation kind of comes throughout the whole book, but here it's he's being tempted to know what's going to happen next, and that kind of fits with the Genesis account, which is they are tempted to eat the fruit from, Adam and Eve is tempted to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil, and that kind of wanting to know things that you aren't being told. And that's the kind of age-old temptation of sin, where it first comes into the world, that thing of wanting to know things, thinking that God is holding out on you and not telling you things and not trusting him. basically. And Diggory does strike the bell in this one and wakes up the witch, the queen, Jadis, who turns out to be the witch who is in the next book. And basically lots and lots of things go wrong after he has given into that temptation, and definitely there are parallels between that and what the Bible says about temptation and sin. Sin just kind of leading you down a path from temptation to sin to death at the end. And definitely you see that in this story where as soon as they've woken up the witch, they are kind of stuck with her, and she's following them around, and she has these magical powers where she is, and follows them into Earth, into this world, and then they have to try and get her out of this world. And it's just, they're trying to deal with the consequences of sin and the consequences of giving in to temptation. And I just think how much easier it would have been for them if they hadn't given it, or if Diggory hadn't given into that temptation. They could have just gone on looking at other worlds and exploring and having adventures, but he gave into that curiosity to take the dangerous route. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. The Heart of the Chronicles of Narnia has a chapter in this book that talks about bad magic and asks some really difficult questions on why did Aslan allow the witch to come into Narnia, and why did he allow her to stay in Narnia, and to do with freedom of choice and free will and sin and temptation. This is quite a deep chapter on that one, and looking at some really difficult questions, theological questions on that. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, this one seems to be so far that type of book. We'll see as we're going on with the other chapters. Hey, so I've continued reading The Magician's Nephew. I'm quite a bit further, but the bit I wanted to talk about was the bit where they finally get to Narnia. Diggory and Polly go to get the witch back from our world, to take her back to her own world, and they grab hold of her, and the rings act like magnets, and they get pulled back into the wood between the worlds, and then they think they're going into the right pool, but turns out they're in an empty world that hasn't yet been created. And so they're sort of stood there in black nothingness, and all of a sudden they hear a voice singing in the darkness, and as they hear this voice singing, the light comes up, and eventually the sun comes up, and they can see the land all around them, and they can see the person who is singing is a lion. And gradually, other things come up and are created, like the stars, and the world is created around them. Trees start to grow up, the earth humps up, and animals break out and start walking around. And it's just this amazing picture of creation. And I just love how C.S. Lewis has portrayed Aslan as this creator God who is singing over creation. And as he's singing, everything is coming to life and being brought to life. And there's so many similarities with the beginning of creation in Genesis, and how God speaks, "Let there be light," and there is light, and how he speaks over all the different creation, and how he makes man out of dust. Those kind of pictures of the animals coming out of the dust, it's so vivid. And I just love the concept that God might have, instead of speaking, might have been singing. And it's not so far-fetched as it might seem, because there is a verse in Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 17 that says, "The Lord your God is with you, he is mighty to save, he will take great delight in you, he will quiet you with his love, he will rejoice over you with singing." And so the idea that God can sing is actually in the Bible, and I just love this illustration that C.S. Lewis gives of Aslan singing over creation. Both the heart of the Chronicles of Narnia and Finding God in the Land of Narnia both have a chapter on this particular part of the story. This one is more theological book. This one is more like a reflection on the story. So this is more kind of slightly more devotional, but doesn't have a Bible study element to it. It's just a thoughtful reflection on it. And this one uses, as I've said probably already, that uses the Narnia to as an illustration of different theological themes. So they're quite different in themes, but they both pick out this one, and not surprisingly, it has such good references to that beginning of Genesis. So I've come to the end of The Magician's Nephew. I enjoyed the ending of it again. Diggory is sent off to fly on a flying horse with Polly to go and collect an apple from a garden at the kind of end of Narnia. And so they're sent off and flying off, and the witch follows them and overhears what they're going to do and gets in there and steals an apple and takes one and for herself, and so she gets everlasting life through that. And she tempts Diggory to take one from him for himself to live forever, which he doesn't want to do. And then she gives him the biggest temptation of all, which is to take one home to make his mother, who's dying, and to make her well. And he has to choose between obeying Aslan and doing what he said and healing his mother. The setting of this part of the book is just like the Garden of Eden with a tree in the middle, but there are some things that are really different about this. For one thing, the tree that is in this book is actually the tree of life and not the tree of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil. And also Diggory doesn't fall for the temptation in this book, whereas Adam and Eve obviously did. And so I thought quite a lot about, which part of this story really represents the fall in the Bible stories. And actually I think that the earlier part, which I talked about before, where Diggory falls for the temptation in Charn and he knocks the hammer against the bell, and everything goes wrong from there, that's really more representative of the fall in Genesis narrative. And here, even though the garden is very similar to the Garden of Eden and the apple and the witch tempting him to take it, this actually for me represents something else. It came to me that it seems to be very similar to the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God asked Abraham to kill his son Isaac, to sacrifice him, and he goes up on Mount Moriah, I think it is, and is about to kill his son Isaac, when God calls out and says, Abraham, Abraham, I've seen that you are going to be obedient to me, but I don't want you to kill him. I'm going to give it a ram instead, so that you can perform an animal sacrifice to take the place of your son. And in this story, I can see some similarities really to that story, because Diggory is put in a place of temptation where he has to choose to sacrifice his mother in order to be obedient to Aslan, and she was going to die if he doesn't do something to help her. But instead, Diggory chooses to be obedient to Aslan, and he takes the apple back, and he throws it into the soil in Narnia, and it grows into a tree very quickly. And Aslan then gives him another apple from that tree, which enables him to take that back to his mother, and his mother gets healed. And so I can see the kind of similarities there, even though the imagery is very like the Garden of Eden. The story is much more like the later story in Genesis of Abraham and Isaac. So those were my thoughts on The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. Let me know if you have any thoughts or comments to add to them down in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. I'll be continuing with this series with The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe next month. So if you want to check that one out, make sure you're subscribed so that you know when I post it. I hope you have a really great week, and I'll see you again. Bye.